I never thought I'd be the guy stalking my ex-wife on Instagram, waiting for her picture-perfect life with a man she left me for to fall apart. But here I am, 45, unemployed, drinking too much, and still hopelessly in love with a woman who told me I was pathetic before walking out. She's moved on, living in my house with my kids and her new, hotter, better boyfriend, while I'm stuck in this cycle of self-destruction, clinging to some delusional hope that maybe, one day, she'll come crawling back. Spoiler, she won't. But I'm still waiting. Alright, so I'm 45, I got a pretty solid job that I've worked my way up in for years. It's stable, good income, nothing flashy, but comfortable. I've got 2 kids. They're both at that age where they're not toddlers, but not quite teenagers either. Right in that sweet spot where they still think I'm kind of cool, but are starting to develop their own personalities. And then there's my wife. She's 40, absolutely stunning, and the kind of woman who turns heads when we're out. She's a businesswoman, driven, successful, confident, the whole package. It's funny how life looks from the outside. On paper, we're the ideal couple. 2 careers, a nice home, healthy kids, and this picture-perfect life. And I know it's true, but it's also not, you know? You get to a point where everything looks good, and you think, is this it? Is this all there is? My wife, let's call her Sarah for now, is always busy. She's one of those people who's always running around. Work meetings, business trips, networking events. I can't lie, it's impressive. But it also means there are nights where I'm sitting at the dinner table with the kids, trying to make small talk while she's halfway across the country for a conference. Don't get me wrong, I'm proud of her. It's just sometimes I wonder if she even sees me anymore. Like she's so wrapped up in her world, and I'm in mine, and we're just orbiting around each other without ever really connecting. You know that feeling? When you're in the same room, but miles apart? We've been married for over 15 years now. It's hard to keep that spark alive with kids and work and the monotony of everyday life. Sarah's still gorgeous, still everything I could ever want in a woman. But lately, I've felt this weird distance between us. It's subtle, almost like we're living parallel lives, intersecting only when necessary. Drop-offs, pickups, family events. The rest of the time, it's like we're coworkers managing the household more than anything else. And that's when things started to get complicated. It wasn't planned, never is, right? I wasn't looking for anything, but it kind of found me. Yeah, it was about 2 years ago when I first noticed the bell rings. That's what I call them now. Those little moments when you know something is shifting, but you can't quite put your finger on it yet. It wasn't anything obvious at first. In fact, I didn't think much of it back then. Sarah had started going on these business trips more frequently, about once a month. She'd fly out to all different parts of the country. San Francisco, Chicago, Miami, you name it. I joke about it sometimes. Off to take over another city, huh? And she'd laugh, but it always felt a little distant. There was something behind that smile that seemed different. Maybe it was just the travel. I know how draining that can be. And she'd come back exhausted, diving straight back into work the next day without a second to breathe. But then, there was a night when the bell rang, and I couldn't ignore it. It was a Tuesday night. Sarah was in New York for some big client meeting, and I was at home, sitting on the couch after the kids had gone to bed. I remember I was scrolling through social media, looking at nothing in particular, when I saw a photo tag from her company's dinner event. There she was, dressed in this sleek black dress, looking every bit the powerhouse that she is. But it wasn't her that caught my attention. It was the guy standing next to her, his arm just a little too casually around her waist. Nothing scandalous, just close. Too close. I didn't say anything about it when she got home. What was there to say, really? It could have been innocent. Probably was. But that was the first time I felt it. This nagging thought in the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right. The trips kept coming once a month like clockwork. I'd be the one to handle everything at home while she was away. The kids would ask, "When's Mom coming back?" And I'd give them the same answer every time. In a few days. They were used to it by now. But for me, it was getting harder to shake that feeling that had started creeping in. We were still good on the surface at least. We'd go out for dinner when she was back, laugh over wine, talk about the kids. But there was this growing space between us. The intimacy we once had, it was fading, like we were going through the motions instead of actually being with each other. I didn't want to admit it. Not to myself or anyone else, but I was starting to feel like I wasn't part of her world anymore. I remember the first time I tried to bring it up. It was about a year into these monthly trips, and something in me had finally snapped. We were sitting at the kitchen table after the kids had gone to bed. She was going over her schedule for the next trip, Seattle this time, and I just blurted it out. "Do Do you really need to go on all these trips? She looked up from her phone, a little surprised. What do you mean? I mean, it feels like you're gone all the time. The kids miss you. I miss you. Can't you delegate some of this stuff? I'm sure there's someone else who can handle a few of these meetings. She didn't even hesitate. You know, I can't do that. These trips are important for my job. You know how competitive it is. If I don't show up, someone else will. I want to push back, but I could see the look in her eyes, determined, focused, and honestly a little frustrated. It was like she couldn't even fathom cutting back on work, like it was a ridiculous suggestion. So, I let it go. I mumbled something like, yeah, I get it, and we went back to our routine, but it stung. The thing is, I did get it. I understood how driven she was. Hell, that drive was part of what attracted me to her in the first place. But it felt like I was losing her to that world. Work had become her number one priority, and everything else, me, the kids, our life together, was starting to feel like an afterthought. A few weeks later, I tried again, this time approaching it from a different angle. I thought maybe we just needed to reconnect, to work on us, so I brought up our relationship. It was late, and we were both in bed, the room dark except for the soft glow of a nightstand lamp. Do you ever feel like we are drifting apart? I asked. She sighed, setting down the book she was reading. What are you talking about? I don't know. It just feels like we're not as close as we used to be. Like we're living these separate lives, you know? There was a pause, and I could tell she was thinking about what to say next. It's just a busy time, she finally said. We've both got a lot going on, work, the kids, everything. It's normal. We're fine. I wanted to say more, to tell her that fine wasn't enough for me, that I wanted more than just this surface-level interaction we had fallen into. But when I looked at her, she was already turning off the light, signaling the end of the conversation. And that's how it always went. Every time I tried to dig deeper, to talk about how we were feeling, she'd shut it down. Not in an angry way, just dismissive, like it wasn't something that needed to be addressed. Like it was normal, and I was the only one making a big deal out of it. The more I tried to talk, the more it felt like I was the one being unreasonable. She'd give me that look, the one that said, you're overthinking it. So eventually I stopped trying. We'd have our brief check-ins, and I'd get the same answer. We're fine. But deep down, I knew we weren't. That's when I really started to feel lost. That's when things started to feel off. It wasn't just the emotional distance anymore. It was the little things that piled up. Like she'd always been good about checking in when she was on her trips. At first, we'd text, maybe FaceTime with the kids before bed, and she'd always answer when I called. But over time, that changed. I'd call her in the evening just to see how things were going, and it would go straight to voicemail. Maybe once, twice, I wouldn't think too much of it. But then it started happening more often. I'd try to reach her, and nothing. No response until hours later, sometimes not until the next day. When I'd ask about it, she'd brush it off with some excuse. Oh, I was in meetings all day, or I didn't hear my phone. But then there were those times when she came back late. I'm talking, her trip was supposed to end on a Friday, and she wouldn't show up until Sunday night. The first time it happened, she claimed her flight got delayed because of some weather issue. Fine. That happens, right? But the next time it was, I had to stay for an extra meeting that popped up last minute, or we were closing a big deal, and I couldn't leave early. And each time, it felt less and less convincing. There was this one trip to Miami. I remember it vividly because it really threw me off. She was supposed to be gone for 3 days. I had everything planned, work, kids, the usual, and she was supposed to be back Friday evening. But Friday came and went, and I didn't hear from her until Saturday morning when she texted, saying she needed to stay another night. Something came up, she said. Don't worry, I'll be back by Sunday. I didn't want to make a big deal of it in front of the kids, so I played it off like it was normal. But inside, I was fuming. I mean, who stays extra in Miami for a business meeting over the weekend without any heads up? And she didn't give any real explanation when she got home, either. Just breezed in like everything was fine, dropped her suitcase, kissed the kids, and acted like she hadn't been MIA for 2 extra days. I tried asking her about it that night. What was so important that you had to stay another day? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, but feeling the frustration bubbling up. It's just work, she said, barely looking up from her phone. You know how it is? These things happen. Yeah, but an extra day? You couldn't have given me a heads up earlier? She sighed like I was being a nuisance. I told you something came up. It was last minute. There wasn't much I could do. And that was it. End of discussion. No real details, no apology, no concern that I might have been worried. It was always the same vague responses, the same indifference. And the worst part? I didn't even have the energy to push anymore. I just let it slide, even though it was eating me up inside. There was this pattern forming, and I didn't want to see it for what it was. Sometimes she wouldn't answer her phone at all, and when she did get back to me, it was like I was a second thought. Other times, she'd be back from a trip a few days late, like it was no big deal. And the excuses, God, they were always so flimsy. But I'd tell myself she was just busy, that it was all work-related, that maybe I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Yeah, I reached a point where I just couldn't shake the feeling anymore. It wasn't just paranoia. All the missed calls, the extra days on these so-called business trips, the vague excuses, it was all adding up. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The worst part was how she acted like everything was fine, like I was the crazy one for even questioning her. But deep down, I knew something was off. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to be the guy who had a spy on his wife, but I couldn't live in this limbo either. It was eating me alive, the not knowing. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I contacted one of those agencies, the ones that deal with revealing cheaters, solving family issues. It felt surreal, sitting there in this guy's office, explaining my situation, feeling like I was betraying Sarah just by being there. But at the same time, I needed to know the truth. The detective, let's call him Mark, was professional, straightforward. No judgment, just facts. He laid out the process, told me what to expect. I'd read enough stories online to know this wasn't going to be quick. He'd follow her for a few months, keeping an eye on her when she was home, but more importantly, during her trips. He said that's where most of the truth comes out, when people think they're far enough from home. I gave him her travel schedule, the cities she'd be visiting for the next few months, and he got to work. Every time she went on one of those trips, Mark or someone from his team would follow her, tracking her movements, documenting everything. He told me to be patient, that these things take time, and that he'd keep me updated with anything significant. The hardest part was acting like everything was normal while knowing that someone was out there, trailing my wife, looking for proof of something I wasn't even sure I wanted to find. Each time she left for another city, I'd feel this knot in my stomach. I'd wonder if that was the trip where he'd find something. I'd wonder what she was doing, who she was meeting with, and if everything I feared was true. It took a few months. Mark was thorough, always giving me updates. Sometimes there was nothing, just a regular business meeting, her in and out of conference rooms, nothing suspicious. But other times, the updates were more concerning. There were gaps in her schedule, times when she wasn't where she said she'd be, places she visited that didn't make sense. And still, I didn't know the full picture. Not yet. Eventually, after months of following her, Mark had the information I'd been dreading. He asked me to come into the office to go over the results. When Mark called me into his office, I already had this sinking feeling. I'd been preparing myself for the worst, but hearing it was a different story. I remember sitting there in that small, dimly lit office as he laid everything out for me. She's living a double life, he said, almost too calmly for the bombshell he was dropping. I couldn't speak for a minute, just stared at him, trying to process what those words even meant. But he didn't leave it there. He explained everything in detail, walking me through months of evidence. It turns out, every time Sarah went on one of those trips, she wasn't just working. She was meeting up with the guy from that New York photo, the one I had brushed off months ago, telling myself it was probably innocent. He wasn't just some colleague or random business connection. He was part of this other life she was living, the one I had no idea about. Market photos. It wasn't just speculation or theory. It was cold, hard proof. He slid them across the table, one by one, and as I picked them up, my heart sank deeper with every image. There they were, Sarah and this guy, let's call him Chris. They weren't just colleagues sharing a business dinner. They were together, in every sense of the word. The first photo showed them walking into a restaurant, her hand casually resting on his arm, laughing at something he'd said. The next one, them sitting close at a candlelit table, leaning in as if they were in their own little world. And then there were the ones that hit me like a punch to the gut, photos of them kissing. Outside a hotel, in a park, sitting in a cafe. Every setting different, but the same intimacy, the same betrayal in every frame. I couldn't even look at all of them. Mark kept talking, explaining how he'd followed them during her trips, how they'd stay in the same hotel room, how they'd go out for dates at fancy restaurants. Sometimes they'd spend the entire day together. Other times it was just a quick getaway in between her meetings. It was clear that this wasn't some one-time fling. It was a full-blown affair. and it had been going on for who knows how long. I just sat there, staring at those photos, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This was the truth I had been dreading, the one I knew deep down but had refused to fully acknowledge. And now it was right there in front of me, undeniable, inescapable. Mark handed me everything, the photos, the reports, all the evidence he'd gathered. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time, I could see that he genuinely meant it. He'd done this 100 times before, but it didn't make it any easier for either of us. The facts were in my hands now. There was no more guessing, no more wondering if I was being paranoid. My wife, Sarah, had been living this double life, lying to me, to our kids, to everyone. And now, I had to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. That day, I knew the conversation was going to change everything. She had just come back from another trip with Chris. I now knew, and I couldn't sit on this information any longer. I waited until the kids were in bed, and I asked her to sit down at the kitchen table, the same place where we'd had so many talks over the years. But this one was different. She sat down looking a little tired, maybe a little impatient, but nothing more. I started off slow. "How was the trip?" I asked, knowing full well what had really happened. She shrugged. "Same as usual. Busy. Long meetings." I stared at her for a moment, the weight of what I knew making it hard to breathe. "I want to talk about these trips, Sarah. I want to talk about us." Her expression changed. A flicker of something, defensiveness, maybe crossed her face. "Why are we doing this now?" "I'm tired. We can talk about it later." "No," I said, more firmly than I meant to. "We're talking about it now." She started to get up, probably thinking she could brush me off like all the other times. But that's when I took out the photos, spreading them out on the table. The first one was of her and Chris, walking into the restaurant holding hands. Then another, them kissing by the hotel entrance. I didn't even need to say anything. The truth was right there between us, laid out in front of her. For a second, she didn't react. She just looked at the photos, her face unreadable. Then, instead of the guilt or the panic I had expected, she sighed, like she was annoyed more than anything. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So you had me followed?" she said, her voice sharp. "I had to," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You weren't telling me the truth. I needed to know what was going on." Her expression darkened. "That's low, you know. You spying on me? How pathetic is that?" I didn't care. Her deflection, her attempt to make me feel guilty for uncovering her betrayal, didn't land. "I don't care if you think it's low. I know what you've been doing. 2 years, Sarah. 2 years you've been lying to me, to our family." She didn't flinch. There was no stress, no fear in her eyes. It was like she'd been preparing for this moment. She leaned forward slightly, her tone flat, almost bored. "Yeah, 2 years. What do you want me to say? I'm not in love with you anymore. I haven't been for a long time." Her words hit me like a slap. I had expected some kind of explanation, maybe even an apology, but there was none of that. Just cold, hard facts. She wasn't done yet. "Chris, he's different," she said, and for the first time, there was a spark of emotion in her voice. "I love him. I've been with him for 2 years because I want to be with him. He's better for me. He's hotter, he's more fun, he's everything I've been missing with you." I sat there, stunned. I didn't even recognize this woman in front of me. This wasn't the Sarah I married, or maybe it was, and I just hadn't seen it until now. "You don't love me?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "No," she said bluntly. "I haven't for a long time. I was just going through the motions. But with Chris, it's different. He makes me feel alive. He's exciting. And, honestly, he's just better than you. In every way." Her words stung. I knew our relationship had issues, that we had drifted apart, but to hear her say it like this, so casually, so cruelly, it cut deep. But I didn't let her see that. I sat there, absorbing everything, trying to keep my composure. "And what now?" I asked, forcing myself to look her in the eye. "What's your plan? Just keep lying to me? Keep lying to the kids?" She shrugged again, like it was all so simple. "I don't know. I was waiting for the right time. Maybe we separate. Maybe we just end this. I don't care anymore." That was the moment I realized it was over. That whatever we had, whatever I had been holding on to, was gone. She had already moved on, emotionally, physically, everything. And there was no coming back from that. I wish I could say I handled it better. That I kept my pride intact and walked away with my head held high. But the truth? The truth is I was a wreck. After that conversation, Something inside me broke. I knew it was over, but part of me still couldn't accept it. I couldn't believe that the woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my kids, the person I'd shared over 15 years with, had completely checked out. So I did what I thought I had to do. I tried to win her back. I know how it sounds. I know it was a mistake now, but back then, all I could think about was saving what was left of us. I didn't want my family to fall apart. I didn't want the kids to grow up in a broken home. So I started this pathetic campaign to try and fix things, even though I knew deep down there was nothing left to fix. I bought her gifts, things I knew she liked, jewelry, flowers, even this expensive purse she'd been eyeing for months. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I showed her I still cared, if I made her feel appreciated again, she'd come back. We'd start fresh. I even wrote her these long letters, pouring my heart out, telling her how much I loved her, how much I wanted to make it work, how I was willing to do anything to start over from a clean slate. I begged her to go to counseling, to give us a chance. But every gesture I made, every attempt to reach her, was met with indifference or worse, laughter. I'll never forget the day I gave her that purse. I'd spent hours picking it out, convincing myself it would be a turning point. I handed it to her, and she looked at me, eyes cold, and just laughed. "You really think a purse is going to fix this?" she said, shaking her head. "God, you're pathetic." That word pathetic had stuck in my head. She threw it around so casually, like I was beneath her now, like all my efforts to save us were nothing but a joke to her. And maybe they were. Maybe I was pathetic for trying to hold on to something that had died long ago. But hearing her say it, seeing the disdain in her eyes, it crushed me. I kept trying for a little while after that, hoping that maybe there was still some part of her that would come around. But the more I pushed, the more she pulled away. She stopped pretending to care. She'd openly talk about Chris now, about how much fun she was having, how much happier she was with him. She told me I was holding her back, that I was boring, that our marriage had been dead long before she started cheating. It was humiliating. Every day felt like I was shrinking, like I was losing pieces of myself, trying to make her see me again. But she didn't. She couldn't. She'd already moved on, and nothing I did could change that. In the end, she was the one who brought up the divorce. I didn't even fight it. How could I? There was nothing left to fight for. She didn't want me, and no amount of begging or gifts was going to change that. We went through the motions, lawyers, paperwork, dividing up assets. I tried to keep things civil for the kids, but even that felt hollow. She was so detached from it all, like this was just another task she had to check off her list. And me? I was still picking up the pieces of whatever was left of my dignity. The day we signed the papers, I remember sitting in the car afterward, just staring at the divorce decree. I never felt so empty. This life I had built, the family, the marriage, it was all gone, reduced to a stack of legal documents. And all I had left were memories of a woman who didn't love me anymore. I had humiliated myself trying to save something that couldn't be saved, and in the end, I lost her anyway. The worst part? She never looked back. After the divorce, it was like I was living in this strange limbo, stuck between the life I used to have and the reality I was trying to avoid. Sarah moved in with Chris pretty quickly after the papers were signed. I'd see glimpses of their new life through social media, and it felt like someone had pressed fast forward on her world while mine had completely stalled. They seemed happy, disgustingly so. Every time I opened Instagram or Facebook, there they were smiling, going on vacations, taking the kids to places I used to take them. It was like she had just swapped me out, plugged them into my life, and kept going without missing a beat. I couldn't help but stalk them online. I'd spend hours scrolling through their profiles, looking at pictures of them together, seeing how much fun they were having. It was like some twisted form of self-torture, but I couldn't stop. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that it wouldn't last. She's in some honeymoon period, I'd tell myself, but it'll wear off. I thought eventually she'd see through the fantasy, realize that Chris wasn't all she made him out to be, and that she'd missed the stability we had. I figured it was only a matter of time before they hit a rough patch, before the novelty wore off, and she'd start thinking about what she threw away. In the meantime, my life fell apart. I lost my job a few months after the divorce. I was distracted, unfocused, barely holding it together. The drinking didn't help either. It started slow, just a few beers after work to numb the pain, but it quickly escalated. Before I knew it, I was drinking every night, trying to fill the void she'd left behind. I'd wake up with a hangover, go through the motions with the kids on the weekends, and then go right back to the bottle once they were gone. It was a vicious cycle, but it was the only thing that dulled the ache of missing her. And God, I still missed her. Despite everything she'd done, despite the humiliation, the lies, the way she laughed in my face when I tried to fix things, I still loved her. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't help it. I kept waiting, hoping, clinging to this idea that one day she'd come back to me. I started telling myself that I just had to wait it out. Chris and her? They were too different. She'd get bored, or he'd screw up somehow, and then she'd realize what she had with me. Maybe she'd reach out, apologize, say she'd made a mistake. In the meantime, I lurked in the background, watching their life unfold on social media like some kind of ghost. The kids seemed to be adjusting, though. That hurt, too. They were spending more and more time with Sarah and Chris, and less time with me. I didn't blame them. They needed stability, and I was a mess. But it still stung seeing them post pictures of family outings, their smiling faces next to Chris like he was stepping into my role as their dad. I felt like I was being erased, little by little. But through it all, I held on to this stupid, desperate hope that one day, things would fall apart for them. That Chris would show his true colors or Sarah would get tired of him. And I'd be there, waiting, ready to pick up the pieces. I convinced myself that if I just waited long enough, I could get her back and maybe, just maybe, we could start over. It's pathetic, I know. Even as I write this, I can hear how ridiculous it sounds. But when you're that lost, that broken, you'll cling to anything that feels like hope, even if it's false. So here I am waiting, watching, drinking too much, stalking their Instagram, trying to find cracks in the perfect life they've built. It's no way to live, I know that. But I can't seem to let go of her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.